Hello. The next session is with these lovely ladies, and it's called Diversifying Women's Football, which feels like a big, big task. We've got 30 minutes to chat about it, and then you guys can ask questions at the end. So we've got Hayley Bennett, co-founder of Nutmegs. We've got Fern Whelan, who is the exec for EDI at the PFA, and Bree Sesay, who co-founded Gold Diggers podcast. Guys, do you want to tell us a bit about the work you've done in your different areas so far?
So I guess I'm sort of representing the fan point of view. In 2019, I set up with one of my friends, Nutmegs, which is essentially like a collective of football fans, and we basically centre women, non-binary people, trans people of colour, and try and create spaces for them to connect through football. So that looks like, getting tickets to get people to go along to matches, holding screenings, and also just having conversations that like centre us. Alongside that, I started off my career, like my whole working life, working in this space. So I started off working at Kick It Out. I then got really interested in like how we can create structural change within organisations, and obviously given the fact that we know that football is not best practice in this area, I started working with some other industries with a view to bring that knowledge back to football. So I sort of do things all ED&I, but my passion is definitely football, and especially getting people who are marginalised to get involved.
Fern, this is your kind of second career as well, isn't it?
So I played football for the majority of my career. I've retired about 2 years ago. So I played for Everton for 10 years, majority of my career, and then I finished at Brighton while in the Women's Super League professionally, and I played for England as well. So for me, since retiring, I've kind of transitioned into this role at the PFA. It's all brand new to me. I'm actually a physiotherapist by trade, so I trained when I was playing, and I worked for 10 years as a physio, so the ED&I space is pretty new to me, and I'm just kind of finding my feet within the women's game, getting onto the ground with the players in the professional game and seeing what it is they need and obviously where the game's going to progress to.
And Bree, tell us a bit about Gold Diggers and why it was important for you to set it up.
So I've always been like an avid football fan. And one thing that myself and my friend realised at the time was that because football was such male-dominated sport specifically, we always felt like there wasn't a safe space for ethnic minority women to talk about football. So we then decided to come up with this concept of Gold Diggers podcast, which was to create a safe space for women to discuss all things men's and women's football without being scrutinised. Because one thing that we realised in the past is that every time we talk about football, we'd sort of be shot down by men with our opinions, saying, no, you don't know what you're talking about, you should go back to the kitchen, you know, the typical misogynistic stuff. So this is essentially where the platform came about, and, you know, since we started the platform, we've been trying to break barriers and just make it more seen and sort of changing the conversation from, oh, you watch football, to tell me more, tell me your opinions on this and that, etc.
So 3 pretty different perspectives that cover a lot of the game. Hayley, let's start with Nutmegs. How important is it? Well, I know it's important because I love it, but how important is it that this space exists? Because a lot of the time, as a fan, we're kind of forgotten, and our experiences as fans are kind of ignored, aren't they?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, I think, because one of the reasons why we set up was just to like create more fun opportunities for people to go to games. A couple of insights have sort of shaped it. First of all, we knew a lot of fans like us either are the only person in their friendship group that likes football, so they don't normally attend games like with other people, so they miss on that social aspect. And then obviously just accessing like tickets to go to football, and the culture within football is really problematic, so we're trying to think about how we can create inclusive spaces within that. I think, you know, and why I really like what Bree just said as well, it's really important that we just create our own spaces, because we can talk all day about all the problems that exist in the structures of football, and I just feel a bit tired. Like obviously I'm paid as a consultant to try and create that change, but we can't sit and wait for that to happen, so we have to create our own spaces where our needs are centred. And I think that is actually a really key part of the resistance. Like, it's all well and good like sitting on boards like I do, but it's so exhausting And we know that we're trying to fix a system which is, to be honest, really broken, that we need to just sort of almost start again. So if we can do things alongside that, we're still going to create those opportunities.
You need to be kind of surrounded by people who get it, right?
100%.
And can listen to you and hear you. Fern and Bree, what have your experiences been like as fans of the sport?
Do you want to take this one?
Sure. I think as fans of the sport, it's always been quite difficult going to games. There have been a few times, even when we've just wanted to go to the pub, there was a time we walked in and the whole pub went silent. And then I had a group of middle-aged white men ask us, are you guys in the wrong place? And we said, no, we've come in here to watch football. And we kind of got like a weird stare. And that's always been the same thing at football games as well, where you kind of just get a weird look like you shouldn't really be here. But that is, again, why we have goal diggers, because we're making ourselves heard and seen, that you don't have to be a specific stereotype to watch or like football. Football is for anybody, do you know what I mean? And that's exactly where it takes us to watching football games as well, where sometimes we go as a group, like, you know, we're just a group of ethnic minority women that enjoy the game just as much as you guys do as well.
Definitely, and I think what you've touched on there in terms of like in the pubs as well, not just in stadiums, but in places that are typically male dominated. I think there's a lot going on around the Women's Euros at the minute. They're putting players out into pubs, female players just going into watching the game, doing podcasts, having a chat about what the experience is like for them, just to try and increase the visibility of, you know, ethnic minority women going into these, you know, spaces that it can be for everyone, and it's not just about your typical. And I think there's actually been some really good coverage ahead of the Euros around that and around the media perception, and they're trying to change perceptions. So the conversations are happening. It just needs to be a little bit more that it transfers into these, you know, into these areas and spaces.
Hayley, I've heard you talk before about reclaiming those spaces like Fern's talking about now. How important is it that we're not just there, we're reclaiming them, and we are resisting, like you said?
Yeah, I feel quite strongly that a lot of the models that we use around like inclusion in football is about like getting, let's just say someone like me, I can talk from my own lived experience only, to like fit into like what it means to be a stereotypical football fan. And there are a lot of initiatives that exist which are all about that, and I just think that's a really flawed concept. Like, even someone contacted me this week on Twitter and was like, oh, would you like to be part of this like fan group thing we've set up? We haven't got any like women, ethnic minority women. No, because it sounds rubbish, and like, I don't want to go into your space and change who I am so that I can feel part of a group. Like, it doesn't make sense. But a lot of these initiatives that are celebrated and like make amazing content are like based on those principles. And I'm quite radical, as most people know. I think we need to think about how we create new systems and new structures, so we can recognise that it's not working for everyone. Like, we keep trying to put everyone in this box of like what a football fan looks like, what they consume, which I think is really like outdated. Like, even this concept of in the Women's Euros, like, I'm seeing a lot of people talk about, oh, this pub is showing the game, let's all like clap and celebrate that. Like, first of all, really, are we celebrating the fact that we've like just got women's football on TV? Like, it's not something we should be celebrating. And then also, like, no one is talking about for the fact that we've got like cinemas that are showing women's football, which are probably more inclusive spaces for a lot of people. So like, one of the things we noticed with Nutmegs really early on is like, if we want to find a space which is truly inclusive to watch football, it's literally impossible, because structurally licensing agreements are made with like the big broadcasters, and they only show games in like basically any venue that revolves around alcohol, like a pub or a bar. And I'm not interested in trying to bring a big group of people to a bar, because a lot of people that I know wouldn't feel comfortable in that environment. Actually, can we change where those licenses are going, or can we find spaces where we can show the game as well? And a lot of venues are just not accessible. If we look at that intersectionality, like, I would never put on an event somewhere which might feel right for me, but actually if you have somebody who's disabled trying to attend, they're not able to. So we have to think about it in like the bigger picture as well.
I think that the Euros has kind of shone a light on so much of that, like you said. Another thing it's obviously shone a big light on that we've all known for years now is the lack of ethnic diversity in the England women's setup. Fern, you've been doing a lot of work on this recently at the PFA. Can you tell us a bit about what you set up recently?
Yeah, so I think before I started the role, obviously, as you say, we all know it's evident. We know there's not as many ethnic minorities, especially in the top elite level at women's football. So, we've seen 3 black players in the England side at the minute. Actually, none of them have actually got that many minutes. So it's been dominated by white players. So for me, it was coming into it as, how can I help to change that or try and affect it? And I set up a campaign which is going to run over the next 3 to 5 years called the See It, Achieve It campaign. And it's been discussed a lot today. If you can't see it, you can't believe it. And for me, it's about achieving within the game. So I work with the women's professional players and the top tier of football. So it's working with them, but it's not ignoring that grassroots. What we've been talking about is how do we then get the next generation of players. So first and foremost, the campaign starts with highlighting the positive role models that we've got within the game. I spoke a lot to the players before I launched it, actually, and they don't see themselves reflected in the media as much as what white players are. There was a video that went out around Women's Day, and it was all white female players. There was no black players on it. There was no Asian players on it. So, they've contacted me personally and gone, what is going on? Why is that happening? So it seemed like the perfect time to launch the campaign. So the first video was Nikita Paris. And it was just her telling her story about her journey, maybe some barriers that she faced, how she overcame them. And as you say, it's about the storytelling a little bit. So that will be the first side of it. And then the second arm of it is going to be peer-to-peer mentoring. So those WSL players will then mentor an under-20s player in the academy. The under-20s will then do the same to the 18s, so that it filters throughout the pyramid, that every player who kind of comes into the women's setup feels like they have some support along the journey, and they don't ever look and think it's too far away, it's unreachable. They can talk to players, they can get lived experiences. We've created that network now so that every year we'll maybe bring them all together at an event so that young girls can actually kick a ball around with the first team players. So I've only been in for like 8 months, but it's, for me, the next steps are about, I've been speaking to clubs. So I've recently been speaking to Chelsea. They've appointed a new EDI lead, and it's collaborating there, and how do we get this filtered into clubs, and then how do we then get it filtered down, into maybe potentially like Goals for Girls or something like that, is how we expand it and how we get the message out there, because I am conscious that when we first launched it, it was all over social media, but not everyone's on social media. So it's getting that message out on the ground as well, and not just, visibly onto your phones and things like that.
And that kind of peer support and being able to talk to people who get those lived experiences is so crucial, isn't it, for a scheme like this? Did you have that when you were playing?
No, I didn't
never.
have anything like that. I was the only black player in my team. I was looking at photos the other day because my niece, she plays at a young level, and they had photos because it's the same team, and it was just me and a sea of white players. And I think at the time I didn't realise it, because that was just the norm for me. I was so young, I was just playing football, I was loving life, but I didn't actually realise the bigger picture. But now I think what's really important is there's so many conversations happening, and it's visibility, it's really important. So I think I went to a training session once, and Rachel Yankee came along, and I didn't realise at the time the impact that would have on me. That stayed in my memory, and that potentially could have been the driving force for me wanting to keep going and keep playing for England at the different age groups, and go and play club football elsewhere. So it wasn't as apparent to me at the time, but I think looking back, actually, that was massive in potentially my journey. So it's about starting that campaign so young girls can hopefully follow in those footsteps.
Do you know, it's funny because I've interviewed so many women about this, and everyone has a Rachel Yankee story. Everyone's like, I saw Rachel Yankee, and I was like, yeah. No matter their age as well.
Yeah.
Bree, when you see the England women's team play, especially when it's all white, bar maybe Jess Carter for 10 minutes, how do you feel as a football fan, as an English football fan?
I just feel like there could just be more representation. I mean, it's one thing I will say, it's great to see, the women's football game on BBC Sport, etc. But when it comes down to that representation, it's like I wish I could just see a lot more, because when you look at the French team, for example, and you just see women like yourselves, and I think about the younger ethnic minority girls too. If they're watching the game, and let's say they see, I don't know, black player or an Asian player, they feel inspired. But I feel like right now when they see that, it's almost like, well, there's no one for them to look up to on TV, on the big screen right now. So it's more, for me, it's more so for the younger generation that I'm more worried about, for them to have that representation at that top level, for them to know that this is possible. If they can do it, I can do it too.
On the French team, obviously, you're right, like the little French girls will be able to see all those, I think it's 16 players that are not white, and be inspired. But Hayley, we also have this weird thing going on in France where the government are moving mad and trying to ban hijabs. So to what extent are they really an example of that representation when they're going through those battles as well?
Yeah, I think you brought up such a good point, and this is why I always like sort of try and champion nuance in these conversations, because often it's really, really missed. So like I was talking to someone on the way up, there's a lot of conversation around, like, for example, I don't know if everyone saw that TikTok of Nikita Paris and the fan. And I know a lot of people have got their issues with Nikita Paris anyway. But I think the reality is, we need to look at the sort of intersections and like the levels of marginalisation, because there are different barriers that like a mixed race woman will face, and a black woman with 2 black parents will face, for example. Are a black woman going to look at the England squad we've got now, where we've got 3 mixed race girls, and think, yeah, that's me? Or are they going to identify additional barriers? There's that. And then we need to look at like the intersection between like religion as well, because the reality is we're not seeing that at all being mentioned in the conversation. And if you look at France, it's a massive, massive problem. Like I actually think I had the France shirt, the really nice one with the polka dots. But like even this year, I really want to like get behind the team, but I would never like go, for example, and go out and support the French. I guess the sort of like FA, because I'm going to go and buy their shirt, and I'm basically condoning what's happening. That's my personal opinion, by the way. Like, I'm not putting that on everybody else, but this is where we do need to have those nuances in conversations, because representation can sometimes be like a bit of a smoke screen. So do we want representation, or do we want like equity, and do we want barriers removed? Because the other thing, like if we deep it, look at the men's team in England. We're not seeing Asian representation in that, but also we're seeing a lot of over-representation in some sports of like, to be a bit more academic here, like black bodies, and I don't necessarily think that that is a solution to all of our problem. There's a reason why we see a lot more black people succeeding in sport, and it is a like byproduct of colonialism, how black people are perceived, and we sometimes forget that those sort of they're not positive stereotypes, they're really harmful stereotypes, can lead to that great representation, but we've still got that massive inequity and like mistreatment. So we have to look at it for a lot of layers. We can't just see like a team and think that's great, because the reality is like there's so many problems that go on that are not necessarily talked about a lot, and we need to stay conscious of that and stay talking about it.
Fern, in your role now at the PFA, are you having these conversations, and how different has it been for you to come from playing to working in those environments where you're having... Oh.
I think I got what you said.
Where you're having to speak to people about it.
I think it's very different, because as a player, you don't see that so much. You're kind of just doing your job, you're just playing on the pitch, and you're part of a big, massive, wider team. So for me, coming into the PFA, I found it very different, because I'm working on my own for a start. I'm part of a team, but we work kind of in isolation. But also it's the other stakeholders as well. So I've found there's, sometimes a bit of politics, there's this, there's that and the other, but for me, it needs to be a collective. So, at the moment, my job is just trying to speak to as many different people as possible to make that more of a collective, because I think, there's this many people in the room, we're all talking about the same thing, so everyone's probably got the same goal, but everyone's going about it in their own different way on how to get there, whereas you probably get more done by everybody coming together. So I am having those conversations. As I said, I've been speaking to clubs, I've been speaking to the FA about how we can maybe bring Achieve It into some of the work they're doing, maybe with Discover My Talent, how we can collaborate and how we can get the message out onto the ground a little bit, and as you're saying, kick it out, show racism the red card. There's loads of people doing some really, really good work, but it's how we collectively do it together, and I think that's what I've found difficult, transitioning from player to the workspace, shall we say, because it's on your own back rather than doing it as a team. So that's where I'm in this space at the minute.
A question for all of you: how much of an effect do you think that would have to have a kind of unified approach to it that we're not getting now?
I feel like I've just spoke loads.
I think a unified approach is probably, it would be great because it's like everybody's coming together, and just as she mentioned, we all have the same goal, but we're going about it in a different way. And I think that's how, if we have a unified approach, we can all support each other in certain ways, where someone might have an open door in one thing and there's something that we can help support you in as well. So I think, yeah, it's a way in the right direction, I would say.
It's like that diversity of thinking as well, isn't it? It's just like, you know, different perceptions or different experiences from loads of different people. You want to hear that. And with the See It, Achieve It stuff, for me, I've said to the players, I want this to be as player-led as possible. It's not me going in with my thoughts on what needs to be done. It's them as players going, I want to share this part of my story because I think this could help so-and-so. And with the mentoring program, it's not just, well, you're black, so you're the black player. You know, we're going to learn about these young girls and their journeys and, you know, what maybe they have faced. And then I already know the players that I'm working with, so then it's how we link them together to get the best out of the program, rather than just it being a bit of an ad hoc, sporadic thing that we're talking about.
Do you think, and this is for you as well, Hayley, because I know you do a lot of training for people in these positions, do you think there are any kind of key policies that really need changing immediately?
I think, like, to answer that and the other question, I think we won't all work together because don't think we can agree on an approach. And, like, personally for me, like, the policy that we need to take is to acknowledge, I guess, what is actually happening, that this is, you know, the system is against us. It's not just, like, the thing that I hate the most when we have these conversations is, like, we do get into this habit of, like, victim blaming. It's like, oh, we don't have confidence. We have cultural barriers, and it's actually like the spaces are not designed for us, which is why we don't have the confidence in the first place. The cultural barriers are not barriers because it's our culture or our norms. It's because the norms that, like, these systems have been created are based on, you know, white men. So let's, like, reframe the narrative first. I think there's a lot of people who are working on great initiatives or, like, programs, but I'm really interested in, like, fixing the system, not, like, fixing the individual or fixing, like, little bits here and there. And I think we can't, like, move forward if we don't look at where the structural issues are. That's something that I'm really, really passionate about. Like I mentioned, like, one of the structural barriers is the fact that the licensing is given to, like, alcohol-based venues. Maybe one of the other structural barriers is the fact that actually there's, like, pervasive, like, racism within some of these organisations and institutionally, and we need to examine that. There's a lot of articles that have come out about this topic. They do tend to go into this, like, victim blaming narrative, like we're the problem that needs to be solved, and then they'll likely address, like, instances of racism that people experience. And I do think, like, yeah, you know, training is one part of it, but we need to also address some of the cultures within these organisations. Like, we've heard from so many people today, like, what you're up against being in these rooms. Like, we need to change that. And I think we need to be careful, like, we need to name things. So, like I said, like, let's not, like, get into this, like, repeated pattern of, like, blaming us, our cultures, or whatever it might be. When things are racist, like, let's name it as that, rather than saying that, oh, we just didn't get on. Like, we need to, like, empower ourselves through like, reshifting that narrative.
Fern, how challenging has that been for you? Because obviously a lot of the time we talk about football as a kind of microcosm of society, and we're in a society that is systemically racist, but we don't like talking about that. So how do you kind of change things within reason, knowing that it's football, but it's also the world that's at fault? Sorry, that is a huge question for
pretty deep, yeah.
Tuesday afternoon.
No, I think in terms of, as you say, the systemic racism, and a lot of it I find is ignorance as well, and it's not wanting to actually understand, you know, what people have been through or their lived experiences, or, you know, what barriers they may face. And a lot of it is about education, and I think even within our own organisations that we work in, we're constantly trying to educate each other. And I'm quite lucky that, you know, the people I work with Simone Pound, who's the head of Equality Diversity. She's a black female. She's worked there for 20 years. She knows her stuff in that respect, and I'm learning off her quite a lot. And also we've got Danielle Carter on the players board, a black player in that respect. So not only the females, but there's black males that I'm learning from. It's quite a diverse organisation, but on the other side, there's a lot of white males that work there who just want to learn, and they want to know, and they want to be educated. It's not that they're just white and they don't care and they're racist. it's about having those conversations within your organisation. So us as an EDI team, we sit and we deliver our equality, our workshop to the rest of the organisation to bring them up to speed a little bit, because a lot of the time some of the language is dated and it's like, oh, I could say that 10 years ago, I can't say that now. So some of those type of things we're trying to do within our organisation, and then it's conversations to challenge as well other organisations as to, you know, what their makeup looks like, what their staffing looks like. Are they doing things as well as they potentially should? Have they thought about their players? So if you've got someone from an Asian background or Muslim and they need to pray, have you got a space for a prayer room for that player? So it's making that a little bit more specific to the players that are coming through, because at the end of the day, my remit is the players and looking after them, not specifically the people who work in these organisations, but we can always still have those conversations with them.
Do you think they're genuinely listening, not just within the PFA, but within football kind of hierarchies? Because if you look today at the audience, it's a lot of women and girls of colour. Mm-hmm. So how do we have those conversations with people that don't actively want to listen or don't want to be in these spaces to care about what we're saying?
Knock on doors. I've knocked on quite a few doors already recently, and just, you know, emails, can we meet, can we chat, can we do this? And even if it's not, they don't think that's what the conversation's going to be about, throw it in. Do you know what I mean? It's like you can always have that conversation, even if you're starting off with, we'll come to talk about See It, Achieve It, but actually can we talk about this a little bit as well and talk about what's going on within your organisation? So I think there's always ways around it in which you can have these conversations. Sometimes you might have to be a little bit smarter to get your foot through the door initially, but then you can obviously have those conversations once you're in.
What do you think about that, Hayley?
I think obviously as an approach it can work. I just think that, you know, going back to the question earlier, there's, you know, we've got Bree doing some amazing work here. There's also something in collaborating with people and like paying people as well, and ensuring that like you've got no barriers like economically, like you're like getting loads of funding and opportunities. Like a lot of people who are running initiatives here today lack resources and funds. And like I think a lot of the time the sort of football bodies and like the gatekeepers that exist in this world, whether it be in the media or whether it be like some of these organisations that people represent, we have to also think about how we redistribute some of the funds and the wealth, because we know that like actually like people who we feel like we, you know, represent us are doing a massive job in this space. And you know, it's all well and good us advocating to create our own spaces and do that, but like for example Nutmegs, we're not funded. We rely on a lot of volunteers and also people giving us stuff for free. If literally someone just gave me £10,000, which is what a lot of these organisations during the Euros are spending on like a drinks reception somewhere, we could make such a big difference. So like let's not like just think about it in terms of like working together and collaborating or having email exchanges. Like let's also give people some money to do stuff.
Sorry, can I just ask on that one, do you apply for funding, or like how do you fund yourself?
Yeah, we have done. I think there's a whole conversation to be had on like funding structures that exist in sport for sure. I think the issue that we face personally, and I'm sure other folks in the room, you know, the other thing I didn't mention in my intro, which I'm not sure I'm definitely allowed to say, Francesca, so sorry, is that I'm on the board for Goals for Girls as well. And a lot of the time when organisations in football, I'm sure folks here like understand that, people think that football's like a wash with cash. So like other bodies that are not football related don't give funding out to football related organisations or initiatives because they think like there's so much money, there's sponsorship, like why would like National Lottery, it's a bad example, but like someone like that give us money. So that's why I do think like FAIR, for example, does really amazing work in giving out small grants to organisations to do those sort of grassroots initiatives that others wouldn't give out.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was just wondering.
Bree, how have you found that? Because obviously podcasting is not cheap, but it's a lot more accessible and an easier way to get into the industry than doing a master's or being privately educated, for example. So how have you found that, and where's kind of the limit of how far you can go without funding?
I will say it has definitely not been easy because you've been doing this podcast now for 3 years and it's all been self-funded. I think this year is probably the first time where companies and brands are finally reaching out to say, we want to invest, what can we do to help you, what are your plans? Because for me, essentially, I want Gold Diggers not to just be a football podcast, but I also want it to be more so like an organisation that helps younger girls, especially that want to have a career in football, not necessarily as a football player, but it's also to show them that there's so many more other opportunities. Because when I was younger, I used to play football, but then, you know, your fitness is not really
Knee
great.
injury.
Yeah, the injury. So for me, yeah, it's not been easy from the very get-go because, you know, when I first started Gold Diggers, I just started my career, so you can just imagine what a graduate salary is. So, you know, having to pay for studio, having to pay for, you know, podcast providers, all of that, it does at the end catch up with you. But yeah, it's just getting to a point where you're being seen and being heard by brands also to be taken seriously, because again, it might come across as easy, but I promise you it's not, because we are really the first black female-led football podcast that has come about. And there's so many other male podcasts that get all the funding very easily, but because we're the first ones doing it, so I feel like sometimes people are a bit apprehensive to really put money towards it as well. So it's almost like we sort of have to prove ourselves that we're really the big deal here. So yeah.
And now when you're being approached by those brands, what do you have to think about in terms of who you want to partner with and what brands want to represent you and vice versa?
I think what's really important to me is what that brand represents, and also whether they're still going to give us the freedom to discuss anything that we want, because what's very important on our platform is that we can discuss, we're not limited to discuss anything in regards to whether there's any touching issues, because again, I see it as being, you know, face of football in the podcast world, we need to be able to touch on these things without feeling that we're limited. That's why when brands or companies approach us, we always ask them, will we still have the freedom to do the content the way we want it, because that is very important. And yeah, I think it's mainly what they can do for us and also what they represent as well, because the last thing I want is to sign up with a brand that is just doing this more so as a reactionary thing, not because they believe in it. So those are the sort of things that are very important to me.
And one last question for all of you, because I think we're over time. How do we move this conversation forward in the future and actually make real tangible change and stop talking about the Wildcats programme that we have to talk about every few weeks? How do we move that forward? No offence to the Wildcats programme, I'm sure they're great. I just have heard too much about it.
I think something that I'll take from the work I do every day, like I always say that for anything to be meaningful, some of the tactics we need to use is this 3 I's. So to be informed, so in this case, like be informed by like lived experience, like what the data is telling us, by what players and fans want, be intersectional. So we're not going to make an impact if we're just skirting around the surface. We need to look at who's most impacted and why, like where are different layers causing barriers, how can we eradicate those? So that's important for me. And the main thing for me is around like being intentional. There's a lot of like discussion around like what the I know I'm going to bash the FA a lot, but it applies to every organisation. Like we're going to do this, and if we reach some ethnic minority women, then that's great. Like that's not going to work, because we know that the barriers that have been put in place are intentional and have existed for a long time. So let's intentionally do things that are trying to address those issues that we want to solve. If we just rely on like hope and chance, we're not going to move forward. So I want to see like positive action initiatives. I want to see more women like what we've had today around the table, like designing and being paid to deliver work, and then I think we'll see that progress.
Woo.
I think I agree, to be honest. I'd say less talk, more action in terms of that. So, I mean, it's been echoed around today, but what can we actually do on the ground, and what can we do to make a difference, rather than, as I say, initiatives are great, but it's following through with those initiatives. And I think data is important. I know we had the debate before whether it was or it wasn't, but it's accountability to see, well, this is where we started with, this is where we're going, and this is where we're aiming to be, and have we done what we set out to do? So it's having that accountability as well in terms of that research that we're looking at.
I think these ladies have said it perfectly well already. It's just about continuing, being seen, not just talking, and just Staying consistent as well, because it's one thing to say, yes, I want to make the change, but it's another thing to actually consistently push for it, because there might be times when you knock on 100 doors and only one person opens it, but that shouldn't be the time to give up. You just have to continue, because when you do, then eventually someone will listen to you, a group of people will listen to you, and you can finally achieve that goal.
Amazing. 100 bricks for 100 doors. Any questions?
I didn't actually want to ask a question, but I feel like Mim has forced me into one. I mean, we've talked about funding a lot, and Hayley's touched up on it, because I run a sport network called Sport Shifts, and one of the biggest barriers to funding is the fact that we only cater to black people, and organizations don't want to give money to specifically black organizations. They want to put the money on the BAME. And also, we don't do participation, which is the main criteria to get funding in sports. So it's what do organizations who are doing the work but don't fit in the main criteria, where do they get the money from? And, Bree mentioned it with sponsorship. A lot of organizations have come to us, but when we say we're only going to have black panelists and that's it, and that's not something we're changing, they kind of back out because they wanted to kind of use us as a rebrand, or use us we actually specifically care for, they wanted to kind of use us to make it look like they were doing the good work. So what other things should we be doing?
Yeah, what I will say, I know Tosin, we know each other very well. I think a lesson we can take is from Black Ballad. So UK publication, the UK that seed funded, I think that's the right term, all of their crowdfunded. Well, they basically got money from the community to demonstrate that this is definitely needed, and it allowed them to not, I guess, compromise or sacrifice anything they wanted to do. I know you have successfully done some crowdfunding as well. I think this is where sometimes people ask us what can allies do? Contribute to these fundraisers, send us your money. When you're having events, send it towards these kind of organisations, Goals for Girls done a crowdfunding campaign as well. That is a tangible thing that's going to move the dial.
But is it hard saying that to people? Or not hard, but are they whoa?
Yeah, people don't want to do it.
Yeah.
It's the reality. Put your money where your mouth is.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, so I'm in quite a fortunate position that I work across 2 host cities within the Euros, and I think that within Manchester, we've achieved a lot and we've made a lot of progress within the last 2 years. But sometimes I look across the other host cities and I guess I question why they haven't done what we have and why they haven't reached the communities that we have. And I guess what I'm asking is advice on how, I'm within the FA and within a county FA, but how can I help other county FAs and the FA to do similar work that I and my colleagues have done?
Do you think that's a case of you as well, personally? You have that want and that desire to make a change. Sometimes I've heard a lot in terms of county FAs getting this pot of money, so we gave every area £10,000, let's say. Someone really took the 10,000 and went out and did this event. It was brilliant. We got 200 girls down, and it was sustainable, and we made it sustainable. And some people just got the money and kind of, what do we do with this? Because they've got it. So a lot of it's hard. You're trying to obviously affect other counties and what they do, or other, FAs, but a lot of it's got to come from within and the actual want and desire of the people employed to actually want to make that change. So I think what you've done, as you say, is brilliant, but it's having the right people in the right positions to actually want to do that. So it might be a little bit further afield from your job to actually who you're employing the right people in the first place to want to make that change.
I think it's really telling who's here today as well. I know there's issues with the train and everything like that, but you're here. I know you're a bit more local. It would be really good to see people in your role from other county FAs turn up to events like this. So how do you now say, attend this event, it was great, this is what I learned, you all should have been here. That kind of conversation is good to hold people to account.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Go on, Fran.
I saw your hand up before.
You kept looking at me, I was like, oh no. So as you're all aware, obviously I run an organisation called Goals for Girls, and this is a really interesting question for me, especially around areas of funding and funding streams, and obviously Hayley hears it a lot because she sits on our panel. But in regards to breaking down those barriers, as you already know, you have the big organisations like the Sports Englands, the National Lotteries, who fund organisations from a grassroots level, but what we find is it's always the same organisations being funded and getting the multi-million-pound funding, but they may not necessarily be having the impact as, for example, you may be having, Bree, or I may be having within the community. So how do we actually break down those barriers?
Great question.
I think, and this is just from the top of my head, but I think if, for example, we were to get sponsorship for, let's say, a national lottery, the way we would be able to break down those barriers is maybe, like Fern mentioned, do like local events that is tailored for these communities as well. I think that would be a start. I think it's also about what you do with the resources you're given as well, because if, for example, you know, again, hypothetically, you're sponsored by a national lottery and they give you so much money, if it's not really going directly to the cause that you presented it towards, then it sort of just leaves you in the same position that you started in. So I think it's more so about, dedicating it towards the cause, like the communities you mentioned, in order to start to break down the barriers.
I would say a lot of that is also the media and media exposure and coverage. I think a lot of the media go to the same spaces, to women's football in particular, and a lot of the time they're not the spaces that are run by women of colour. So I think we need to get better at going to different places and looking at all the work people are doing, because we don't, and it's a huge responsibility of ours as well.
I think we need to prioritise, like, grants should exist that, like I said, to go back to my intentional point, that actually prioritise, like, organisations that are led by minority ethnic women. And there were some grants, like during Black Lives Matter, when everyone actually pretended to care for a little bit, that did happen. But then it just gets forgotten about again. And I think Sport England need to be really intentional about that. But then again, they don't tend to fund football-related initiatives. So I think it's one to take back to Football Foundation, Fran. Like, I think they need to start thinking about who, what clubs and what facilities they're funding and who's running that, and like actually monitoring that when they're asking the questions in the application forms.
Does anyone else want to add anything? Yes.
Just because, I'm a bit nervous. Because, I don't know if I broke it.
Shout.
Ooh. Should I shout? Okay. Because speaking about... You know what, I'll just shout. Because we were speaking if you can. Okay. Because we were speaking about National Lottery Fund, I don't think organisations realise that that's a barrier in itself. So, I'm a Pakistani Muslim. I'm just going to give up. I'm a Pakistani Muslim, and for me, National Lottery is a lot of money.
We need some more halal funding in here.
Yeah, also, I think just to add to that, like, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but National Lottery have just funded LGB Alliance, and I think if we're looking around inclusion, that is going to be a massive barrier. They're under a lot of fire for who they're funding in terms of like anti-trans organisations. So, yeah, I mean, we use them as an example because they are the biggest funder out there, but they can be very problematic, and of course they're not accessible to Muslim communities of all different ethnicities.
Brilliant. I think, sorry, we've run over a lot, but it's just so interesting. Can we have a massive round of applause for these three legends? Thank you so much, everyone.